Hey everyone, welcome to Base 10 Montessori. And today I wanted to go over Chapter 2 of The Absorbent Mind by Maria Montessori. And I'm going to admit that this chapter has really challenged me in a lot of different ways because I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the things that Maria Montessori said. So thinking about this chapter and trying to think about how I would present this as an important part of her work, but not necessarily something I agree with, has been that's been really difficult. So I'm just going to state, first of all, I think it's important to understand context. So I'm going to leave up this link to the timeline of Maria Montessori's life. And as you're thinking about chapter 2, maybe think about what influenced her life and then maybe check out more deeply the timeline of her life here on Montessori-AMI.org. So that being said, I'd like to go into discussing chapter 2 as best as I can. And like I said, this is perhaps the chapter where I will most criticize and differentiate my ideas with Maria Montessori. I love the Montessori method. It has given me new life and new skills as an educator. There are scientific truths that I have learned to value through my experience and understanding of her method, but there are also times when I read her philosophy and a red flag goes up in my heart, and I've learned to trust that and understand that there's something about that just isn't sitting quite right with me. Chapter 2 is one of those red flags. If I had not seen Montessori classrooms, if I hadn't understood the materials, and if I had picked up the Absorbent Mind to try and understand Montessori, I most likely would have put down the book and walked away from this method because in chapter 2, I find some of her thoughts misguided. If you share those same beliefs as me, I want to work through these concerns with you. If you are reading through this and you have some of the same concerns, hopefully we can walk through this together and kind of pursue this difference in ideology or difference in philosophy together. If you share the opposite beliefs from me, then chapter 2 is probably perfect for you the way it is. And you can probably feel free to skip this video and enjoy the chapter untouched by my thoughts and perspectives, and just maybe comment below about what really stood out to you, what inspired you, and why you think that that this is everything she said was correct. So in chapter 2, there are ideas that I disagree with, and I'm going to push back on what she wrote. So if that's something that you're uncomfortable with, maybe this isn't the video for you this time around. It is quite possible that I'm not understanding what she is saying, or maybe I'm not understanding the context in which she was trying to convey a certain idea. So as I thought about that and I tried to think about maybe my misunderstanding is on my part, I thought maybe it's important to understand as much as possible of what shaped her life and what the state of society and education was when she wrote her philosophies. And that way we can kind of see from her perspective before we insert our own. And that's why I brought up the suggestion for the timeline of Maria Montessori's life. You'll kind of get to know a little bit more. But there's some things that are left off the timeline that I kind of want to go into at the moment before I get into breaking down chapter 2. So I'm just going to leave that timeline up for just a few more minutes and give you a little bit more into what was going on in Maria Montessori's life before we get into chapter 2. So before starting her career in education, it's important to understand that Maria Montessori's past, from a personal perspective, had a lot of influence, I believe, on how she did things later on in life. So I believe her experiences influenced how she thought about parents, children, and education. And I think that's pretty fair to say that, because I think that that's true for all of us, right? Our experiences shape and mold us. So first of all, as a child, she was absolutely brilliant. She was gifted. She was one of 2 girls, I believe, permitted to learn in an all-boys school because she wanted to be an engineer. And so she advocated for that education, even though it wasn't common at the time for girls to have that type of an education. So this was difficult for her, and I've heard and read from other places that she often needed protection from the school to receive that education without harm or harassment from her classmates, which were boys. Later at university, she decided to become a medical doctor. Now, her father did not support this idea. And at first, I believe that the university turned her down and would not let her get a degree. But she pursued it nonetheless. She continued going on the route of becoming a medical doctor, and she was one of the only women to do so during her time, and she did graduate. And just to give you a little perspective of what it was like for her during that time to be a woman getting a medical degree, during that time she was forced to work on cadaver bodies separately than men, because it was indecent for a woman to look at a naked body in the presence of men at that time. At least that's the way I understand what happened. So she would do her medical cadaver studies during the night with a lamp, because she could not work on them during the day with men. So imagine all the hurdles she's going through at a time. Like she couldn't get the education she really wanted as a child without having to fight for it. And now she's at the university, and she has all these extra hoops to jump through that the men don't have to jump through. So I can imagine that shaped her perspective quite a bit. So if you consider that, some of the struggles that she went through, you can probably see why she's so passionate about education for everyone. Now, on a more personal note, Maria Montessori had an affair while she was a medical doctor. The man's name was Giuseppe Montesano. I don't know if I said that right, but anyways, he had promised to marry Maria Montessori, from what I have read or what I've understood. But his mother did not approve of this relationship. So Maria Montessori became pregnant, and you can imagine in late 1800s Catholic Italy, this did not go over well. So Maria was convinced to give up her child, Mario, for adoption. In the meantime, Giuseppe married another woman, one his mother did approve of, and Maria was left without her son and without the man who had promised to marry her. And now again, this is the way the story has been told to me. So as far as I have understood it, she visited her son often, but it wasn't until he was a teenager that he discovered that she was his mother. And so we've got a little bit of, again, a personal struggle there. In regards to her career as an educator, though, Montessori was born almost 100 years after Froebel. And if you know who Froebel is, or if you don't know who Froebel is, he is the father of the kindergarten. So he introduced this new concept in education by proposing an educational environment for young children, a learning garden. So Montessori studied the methods of Itard and Séguin, and there was this new influence from Froebel about this learning garden for young children. And as she studied Itard and Séguin, who worked most notably with deaf children, she began to form her own ideas about learning. When Montessori began her career in education, she was still seeing the neglect of children in society. So this hadn't gone away since Froebel and Itard and Séguin, right? This is still something she's very much working to understand herself. So when she began her work at her first, what we call her first casa, the children there, they had no education. Both parents were working all day long, and of course, these are children in poverty, from families working and trying to just pay some bills. So after working as a medical doctor and psychologist, most notably in asylums with children who were thought unable to learn, Montessori began her career as an educator, taking care of children in the community that people had asked her, can you do something with these children? They have nothing to do all day long. So that's where she got her start. And she believed, from her experiences, she believed that not only could children with disabilities learn, but the educational methods used with children with disabilities could also be applied to children without disabilities. So as we go through and we think through what she had experienced in her life, I think that helps really set up chapter 2 to understand a little bit more about what influenced her life. But also, I want to keep something else in mind. keep these experiences in mind, and also understand that Maria Montessori lived through many wars and even saw her son Mario imprisoned on a trip to India when Italy joined with the Germans in World War II. So we can also see how that shaped her life as well. So both when you look at it personally and professionally, there's a lot of stuff that happened in her life. So during the late 1800s, early 1900s, and of course we can see with the world wars what was going on, Marxism and socialism were huge movements in Italy at that time. So these ideas also would have influenced her. These ideas would have a great influence on Montessori while she was developing her educational methods. So even with the most scientific mind, it is important to consider the influences on her life and compare them to our own when trying to understand what she was trying to say in this chapter. And I think if you keep that in mind, that will help give you some context for chapter 2. Now, that's not to say that everything in chapter 2 I agree with, because again, I don't. But I think I can understand where she's coming from based on what she was seeing. So I'll just say, if you are very socialist or Marxist leaning, then chapter 2 may be perfect for you the way it is. So feel free, like I said, to skip maybe this video if you don't want to hear an alternate point of view or an opinion that might be opposed to what you're thinking. And just go ahead, read chapter 2, find the quotes that really that you find to be inspiring, and feel free to post them below. And feel free to say why you think it's important that these ideas get carried out the way she said them in chapter 2. But for me, I feel like chapter 2 misses the mark of education, and it adopts more of a socialist Marxist view as an answer to the problems Montessori saw during her time. But I, from a personal standpoint, do not support a socialist or Marxist theory. So I am going to be a bit more critical of Montessori in this chapter. So I'll leave you right now to decide whether or not you want to continue forward with listening to my opinion and my response to some of her quotes in this video, or if you want to skip it or join me with thinking through all this. So I'll let you decide that. So that being said, I'm going to move to the quotes for chapter 2. I believe they start on page 7. So let me back up my pictures right here. Okay. So page 7 in my book, I have written down some of the quotes that I thought were most important. And on page 7, the first quote I come to is, "Education must become coextensive with life." And I don't really have a disagreement with that, right? Learning is an important part of life, and what you consider to be learning is a whole different question, but I think that's pretty logical right there. And then she goes on to say, "The central point of education must be the defense of life," which is an interesting thought. I don't have an extensive thought on that right now, but I just thought, that's really interesting. The defense of life. Education must be the defense of life. So we're saying here education is going to make a difference notably in life. It's not just an extravagance, right? It's not just something for the elite. It's something that everybody needs. So she goes on to say, "Education as today conceived is something separated both from biological and social life, and all who enter the educational world tend to be cut off from society." And this is really interesting, and all I really can think of in response to this quote is this still true? Is it still true that all who enter the educational world tend to be cut off from society? And I don't know if I have an answer as much as I have a question. Is this still true? And I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are. So if you have a thought on that quote, I'd be interested to read what your interpretation of that quote is. Because in my mind, I'm still thinking through, well, do I believe that to be true, first of all? And if it was true in her time, is it still true now? So I haven't fully processed that quote yet, but I find it really interesting. And then she goes on to say, "But up till quite recently, it could be said the university took not the slightest interest in conditions of their physical or social life. If a student were underfed, or if defects in sight or hearing diminished his aptitude, he merely received lower marks. And in response to this quote, I thought, is this less of an issue in modern society, or are we still dealing with this? Because I do know that we've made a lot of accommodations at school. And I think maybe parents of children who have disabilities, who are struggling in some way, shape, or form, may say, we got a lot of work left to do. But maybe a teacher who is working a lot with inclusion might say, we're really accommodating, right? Or maybe you have a different thought on there, but I think we are making a lot of progress in looking at a student separating disability from ability, right? That the disability doesn't define the child. And we also have been more proactive at looking what the child's ability is. That's one of the first steps in special education, not just to diagnose the disability, right? Not just to look at what the child can't do, but what are their strengths. I think that there's a lot of reform in education that's gone on to change that thinking. So I think that we are making progress, but again, other people's perspective on that might be different. Maybe your experiences have showed you that we are not making much progress. So I'd be very interested to see if you have a thought on that topic. So she goes on to say again, no one yet asks whether the student's mind may not be threatened or even damaged by defective and unsuitable education methods. And I think personally that this is a quote we need to revisit in modern society. I think this is something actually that I would argue is happening a lot today, that this is actually an argument the parents are having currently with school systems. And from what I'm seeing a lot of is a lot of parents are coming out and saying that children are becoming the victim of education because there is a lot of indoctrination going on that a lot of parents don't want. And of course, some parents do want that. So again, there's that argument there. And is the student's mind being damaged in this? And that's a question you have to ask yourself. Now, there's a lot of argument for homeschooling because of this idea of the student's mind being threatened or damaged by defective or unsuitable education methods. And I think what we're talking about now in modern society has changed because maybe in this quote, Maria Montessori is referring to the fact that during her time, children were given adult chairs, adult tables to sit in, right? Everything was geared towards an adult. And when she came along, she changed that. She changed the environment to be child-sized. So perhaps that might be more what she's thinking of, or maybe it's the fact that children were forced to learn passively instead of actively with concrete materials, right? So I think there's a couple of different ways you could read into what she was saying from her perspective, but what does it look like from our perspective today? And I think when you look at the different pieces of society, let's take a look at the upper class, some more elite society. Do they use the same educational institutes that the poor do? And as someone who's worked in Head Start and Montessori, I've worked in public schools, I've worked in childcare, there's a lot of difference between the people who attend Head Start and the people who attend Montessori. And it's interesting and almost ironic, right? Because Montessori started out working in asylums, helping children that society had tossed aside and thought couldn't learn. And it was that experience that brought her teaching poor children whose parents worked all day. She even stated that wealthy children could never appreciate her methods the way poor children could. And yet, it seems to be that the upper class society seemed to have access to her methods and not the poor. So we've kind of switched in this society today. And, my question is the fact that we have two different types of education systems going on in the United States, one government funded that the upper class or elites or the politicians don't use. And then we have the private sector, which, as a Montessori teacher, I have had politicians, children and grandchildren in my classroom. So it's, for me, really interesting to see where everybody kind of thinks children thrive in education and what's available for free and what's available for money. And you start to wonder, how does this play into the conversation of what are we doing for children's minds as well as their body? So I think it's kind of an interesting, and we're going to get into chapter 2. She talks a lot about society and the state and whose duty it is to supply all these things. So I think it's really interesting to kind of look at school systems and who uses which school system within the United States, to kind of look through and see where are there some conflicts going on, and how does that affect the child's, not just the child's physical environment and their physical development, but also their mental development as well. So it's just something interesting to think about. And then let's go to page 8. So page 8, she starts by talking about what happens then is that young people leave the university with their minds so shackled and sacrificed that they have lost all power of individuation and can no longer judge the problems of the age in which they live. That's kind of a powerful statement right there. And again, we're seeing this argument come up in modern society of how are students coming out of the university systems. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on how students are coming out from the university system here in the United States? I believe this might be even more true now than when she was alive. So it's kind of interesting to see that some of the quotes that she has and her thought process still apply to modern society. So I don't have a lot to say other than I'm kind of interested in what your thoughts are in terms of the university system. She also says the world of education is like an island where people cut off from the world are prepared for life by exclusion from it. And that's really an interesting statement, that they're cut off from the world because of education, their exclusion from life. And I think that might be what inspired her to have this air kinder idea. And for those who aren't familiar with the air kinder idea, it's the third plane of development education. And third plane of development is ages 12 to 18. And what she proposed was a farm school or an apprenticeship type work. And that your formal academic learning is also going to come into play with a skill-based learning system. So the development of the hand in connection to the mind, again, just like the first plane of development of 0 to 6 is really important in that third plane as well, is that the teenager needs to have this purposeful work with their hands, and they need to prepare for life with a skill. And I think when I read her idea of people being cut off from life means that we're so protected in these academic environments that when we get out of them, we don't really know what to do with ourselves. And I think that is also still true in our current society. So, and then she says, those who pass are awarded a diploma or a degree. That in our day is the loftiest summit reached by institutional education. Meanwhile, research workers investigating social problems are discovering that university graduates and school licenciates, I don't know how to say that word, that's a really tough word, are not prepared for life. And not only this, but their capacity for engaging useful in social work has been diminished. So again, I still think that's true today. We're focusing a lot on academics, but not on practical life skills. We don't have life skills when we come out of the university. And I'd also be interested in understanding more about the term social work. Now, I know what I think of when I think of the social work, but I don't know if my definition and her definition are the same. So I'm not sure if I fully understand her context for this term in chapter 2. So if you have an idea of what she's referring to when she's talking about the social work, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that as well. So I'm going to move to what would be page 9 in my book. And she says that society proclaims that young children belong to the home and not to the state. So my comment on this is that, yes, I believe this as well. Do you believe this? I guess I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that. But I think that's a pretty simple yes for me. I think so. And then she goes and she says, all that anyone thinks of so far is that home life could be improved, in the sense that a training for motherhood is now held to be necessary. But the home is not a part of the school. It belongs to society. So, in effect, the human personality or the care of it is broken. On one side is the home, which belongs to society, but which lives in isolation from society and is neglected or ignored by it. On the other side is the school, also shut off from society. And finally, the university. Hence, there exists no true system of help for the development of life. And there's a lot to think through on this. And I have to really start at the beginning and think, do I believe this? Do I believe that just because a child operates in one system means that they're cut off and deprived? And I from my perspective, I have to say, I don't know where the scientific evidence is to say that. It's an observation, right? But to say that the human personality or the care of it is broken because the child is either at home or at school, and that's cut off from society. In my opinion, this might be one of her more unreliable observations, maybe based on a personal bias. And I'm not sure, how does it fracture a child to have different social circles in life, I guess is my question. Because children are not put together in a classroom at birth, does that mean by default they're in isolation or neglected? And I guess I also want to understand more about the term society that she uses here. Is society a term for the private sector? And why can't there be a time for being at home and a time for being at school? So are parents really not able to offer a true system of help for the child? I have a lot of questions in regards to this quote. I don't know about you, but the more I dive into it, the deeper I kind of get, and the more I kind of start asking more questions. And for that matter, what about, let's say, the church? I sometimes wonder, and this might be a very controversial statement I'll say right here, just to give you fair warning. I sometimes wonder if these statements that she made stem more from the socialist trend in politics at the time. And I also wonder if they're influenced by her struggles to get that adequate education for herself when she was younger, right? And maybe also the heartbreak of giving up her child for someone else to raise. I sometimes question her motivation for these statements, and I personally feel as though these statements are made because maybe she didn't get to enjoy motherhood the way that most women did at the time, and she was denied something, right? Something deeply, deeply personal. And while maybe I'm totally off base here, but I can only imagine the pain her soul must have experienced to watch someone else raise her child, and perhaps that person even did it less proficiently. I have no idea the context in which Mario was raised. But I do wonder how a woman overcomes that grief, right? Did Montessori overcome that? Is she truly being scientific? Or is she being perhaps a little too critical of motherhood? Is she being critical of the education she was constantly being denied by being born a female? Is she fighting for rights she wanted as a child? Or is this observation true for everyone? And I also wonder, does she go too far in the opposite direction? And is she too critical of parents? I don't know. Sometimes when I read these quotes, I come up with a lot of questions. So again, I have more questions than answers with this particular quote. So if you have a thought on that, if you have some clarity on that, I'd love to hear what you think. So leave a comment down below if you feel like you have a really good viewpoint on this. So page 10 in my book, she says, resting no longer on a curriculum or a timetable, education must conform to the facts of human life. I like that quote. I don't really have anything more to say about it. I think education must conform to the facts of human life. I think education outside of the facts of human life probably doesn't make much sense, does it? So if society holds it necessary to make education compulsory, This means that education has to be given in a practical fashion, and if we are now agreed that education begins at birth, then it becomes vitally necessary for everyone to know the laws of development. Instead of education remaining aloof and ignored by society, it must acquire the authority to rule over society. And that is a really interesting quote. Again, if you kind of dissect it, I'm really interested in what she meant by rule over society. What does that mean? What do you think it means? And how does that fit into today's modern society where education and government seek to replace parents or maybe have more authority over children than parents do? Who holds education accountable if education is to rule society? I just kind of see that as a open door to corruption when any one thing is to rule over something. And so that I'm a little concerned at her words in this particular quote. And what if people who use the methods of Montessori but have skipped that vital, important step of her methods of preparing the adult? What if that person doesn't prepare themselves? What if they're not humble people and they take this opportunity to abuse their power in the education system? So I have a lot of concerns about that. Like, I don't understand this concept of rule over society. No one thing, I think, is competent enough to rule over society. So I think that we need to have a balance of power here. Modern society borrows from her methods a lot, right? Even public schools borrow a lot from Montessori methods. We have a lot of public school teachers going to Montessori training, but a lot of the times that first step of the transformation of the teacher spirit is lost, right? That spiritual progress, that spiritual development of the teacher, that humility. And if humility is not a virtue to be acquired in modern teaching, then it doesn't matter what teaching method you use. I think it has to start with that. It has to start with that first the preparation of the adult, the preparation of the educator. And so if you can get that part right, well, then you're good to go on pretty much any method. I personally love Montessori's methods, but also keeping yourself in check first is the most important part of any type of teaching philosophy. So anyways, that's kind of my thought on that quote. And then she goes on to say, fathers and mothers must shoulder their responsibilities. And if the home fails for lack of means, then it is required of society not only to give the needed instruction, but also the support necessary for bringing up the children. If education signifies a protection of the individual, if society recognizes as necessary to the child's development things that the family cannot provide, then it is society's duty to provide those things. The state must never abandon the child. So I think the fact that she said it is society's duty to provide those things and the state must never abandon the child. My first question for this quote is, define society. How would you define society in this quote? And my second question is, define state. I assume by state she means government. And my question to this is, why is this society or the state's duty? And my other question is, why aren't families providing? I guess let's take it back one step further of the child's needs aren't being met, right? The families can't meet the child's needs. And I guess what I would do, I wouldn't look at the child in isolation, but I'd ask, well, why aren't families providing? What's going on? What's happening that's causing the families not to provide? And I wonder what Maria Montessori's response to that would be, because I don't see that she's addressed that anywhere. So it feels more like she assumes the failure is on the part of parents. But what if the government or society are the problem? What if there's something going on in government, there's something going on in society keeping the parents from providing for the child? Wouldn't it make more sense to fix that issue than for the state to come in and take over the parent's role with the child? So if that's true, if the government has failed the family, should the government also have access to the children after failing the parents as well? And to me, the answer would be, well, no. If the government's failing the family and the family's failing the child, then we need to do something at the root cause of it. And then the child is going to be a victim until we can fix that root cause. And that's my opinion on that. But I understand there's a lot of opinions out there that might be different than mine. So feel free to share that down below. And I guess my other question for this quote is there anyone else that could provide for the child if the family unit fails to do so? And I'm wondering, is education from Maria Montessori's perspective a replacement for parenting, a supplement for parenting, or a fail-safe if the family unit does not have the means for the child? So I'm just kind of wondering, what is she proposing here? Is she suggesting it should be all of these things? It should be a replacement for parenting, a supplement for parenting, and a fail-safe? And how does the role of the teacher change in each of these scenarios? Who holds society or the state accountable if they fail the child? And who gets to define what failure is? So there's a lot of questions I have based on this quote. There's a lot of things to dissect. I have a lot of questions. And if you have an answer to any of those below, leave your answer below if you do have an answer, and I'll be interested in reading it because I have a lot of questions with this one. And then on to page 11. So page 11, she writes, "This means that society's first step must be to allocate a higher proportion of its wealth to education." And I think there's a lot of people in the United States that believe that. I think there's a lot of people around the world that believe that. And when I look at this quote, I want to think historically at the moment and recognize that the influence of socialism seems to be the answer that Montessori is discussing here regarding the solving the problem of children who come from failed homes. And my question is, are there other solutions to education than socialism and taxation? And if so, what are they? And do you have any solutions out there outside of socialism or taxation? And I would love to hear more about your ideas. I know a lot of people are doing homeschool. I know people are doing homeschool co-ops. Co-ops are an interesting idea that I think could have a whole different discussion on the home environment, the education environment, and society all kind of coming together in a new way that wasn't really discussed before. So I think that could be an interesting discussion that might fit into that a little bit better. So she goes on to write, "Education, so conceived, no longer matters only to children and their parents, but also to the state and to international relationships. It becomes a stimulus to every part of the social body, a stimulus to the greatest of social improvements. Is there any more immovable, stagnant, and indifferent, anything more immovable, stagnant, and indifferent than the education of today? When a country has to economize, education is sure to be the first victim. If we ask a statesman for his views on education, he will say it is no concern of his, that he has left his children's upbringing to his wife, who in turn has entrusted it to a school. In the days to come, it will be absolutely impossible for a statesman to give such an answer or to show such indifference." So that's interesting, right? That is prophetic, actually, because I believe that we see a lot of that in current politics today. So in this quote, she really uses education. She refers to it more as an economic stimulus to society. What if education, though, could be corrupted and instead of a stimulus, it's used as indoctrination camps? Because a lot of people are making those arguments today, right? They're making the case of this is not about the well-being of society anymore. It's about indoctrination. There are a lot of parents arguing that right now. And it's a big reason why parents are pulling their children out of school right now. So while I understand the concept of education as a stimulus or as a benefit to society, which ultimately that's our goal, right? But also what happens when it's corrupted, when the politicians realize the value of early childhood, the value of education, and realize what they can do with education. If a corrupt individual comes in, that's a lot of power over a lot of people's minds. Where then should education turn, and whose duty will it become to save it from corrupt people? Modern society has seen the value of education, in my opinion, particularly early childhood, and I think we're seeing a global war being fought for the control over children's minds and development. And whether you're on one side or the other of that war, there's some strong feelings going on in both camps right now. So I'm not sure where you stand on that one, but it is an interesting, almost prophetic statement. Well, not almost, very prophetic statement that she would say that. So I find that a very interesting quote to think about. So my last few quotes of chapter 2, pages 12 and 13 in my book, she says, "We used to say it was the mother who formed the child, for it is she who teaches him to walk, talk, and so on. But none of this is really done by the mother. It is an achievement of the child." And I just want to pause for a second and see, are there any mothers out there listening to this and thinking, I agree with that? Or are you thinking, I really disagree with that? My question comes back to, what about Victor, the wild child of Aveyron? What was he deprived of by not having a mother to help him form his walking and his talking? And yes, a teacher could have done that. She could have come in and taught someone like Victor how to do those things. But we've also seen from studies about children raised in orphanages without mother figures that they have attachment issues, right? That they have a failure to thrive. And if the mother plays so little of a role, I'm going to go the religious route here, so be prepared for that. If the mother plays so little of a role, did it matter who God chose to give birth to Jesus, right? Well, the mother doesn't really form the child. How does that affect your view of, on a religious note, right? How does this thought affect your view of the mother? And I also want to say here, remember, Montessori was born in Catholic Italy, and I'm wondering how these statements would have been received in Catholic Italy by mothers. Her thoughts about the mother not forming the child, I wonder if that was incredibly controversial at the time. And I can tell you right now that they might still be very controversial right now, too. So if you're a mother out there and you have an opinion on this particular quote, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. She does go on to say, though, to recognize this great work of the child does not mean to diminish, I see a little typo there, diminish the parent's authority. Once they can persuade themselves not to be themselves the builders, but merely to act as collaborators in the building process, they become much better able to carry out their real duties. So parents are to be collaborators and not the builders of children. Do you agree with that? Does that sound right to you? If so, leave a comment. If not, tell me why. Why do you feel you would be the builder and not the collaborator in the building process? So I'm interested to see what your take is. And my take, and again, this is going to come as a teacher in modern society. And I'm just going to say I have yet to meet a parent who is incredibly rational, objective, and scientifically unbiased about their children. And when I talk to parents, I expect them to be emotional. I expect them to be not necessarily scientific or separated, logically, able to see what's going on. And I think as teachers, we need to also accept that parents love their children in illogical ways. And if we can help them on the journey by offering them new insights and skills, we will, right? But I can't expect a parent to be so separated from their child that they can easily view their child with maybe such objectivity and distance. Because sometimes I think she wants them to see their child from a scientific point of view. And while there's a lot of adults out there who are capable of that, I also think we also have to expect parents to be emotional, right? And perhaps it is dysfunctional in some cases the way that parents relate to their child, but I usually find that this is a survival response. It's how they've worked out how to protect their children. And then when we start thinking about that, the way that a parent relates to their child, it also, in modern society, that starts wading into a very different science than education. So when I think about this, the more I think about this, I keep on thinking we're going too far into the systemic integration theory or family therapy. And the teacher's job is not to untangle dysfunctional behavior in the family unit, but we can give advice, right? We can give advice when prompted. But as a teacher, I'm not, unlike Montessori, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm simply a teacher trying to create an environment of learning for the child. And so as she's talking to parents and trying to help them understand that they need to help their child adapt to society and become more independent, which I'm all about. I'm probably being a little too critical here, but at the same time, I'm just thinking of a pushback I get from parents as well on, but this is my child. I'm not ready for my child to be potty trained. I'm not ready for my child. And I understand that a lot of times the parent is not ready when the child developmentally is, and we have to wade into those territories where it's really, really difficult. But at the same time, there comes in current society for the teacher that boundary of saying, okay, I have this to offer. And beyond that, my focus isn't on the parent. And I would need to recommend maybe another professional with a different set of skills to handle a lot of those issues. And so I think this quote is probably more for speaking to parents and not quite as much to educators, because I really feel like when you start getting into the family unit and start getting into how to help parents, there is that boundary that you need to set up and certainly give advice. Like my usual advice is read Love and Logic. I really like Love and Logic. Jim Fay keeps it pretty simple. I like that more than Positive Discipline, whatever our other stuff that's out there. So that's my recommendation. But other than that, I really try to keep it on the child, because a parent isn't going to be objective a lot of the time with their own child. And if they do, it usually takes years of work to get to that point, and we want to support them as much as possible. But I don't know. I'm kind of torn with this quote. So I guess I would appreciate hearing from more parents on how they feel about that. I don't necessarily think she's wrong, but my view is that parents don't always act logically and we need to expect that because they're emotional. It's their child, right? And there's a difference between how I view a child and how parents view their child. I'm going to be a lot more objective. I'm going to be a lot more scientific in how I'm looking at the child. And the parent just wants to love them, keep them safe, provide for them, and enjoy life with their family. And it doesn't get a whole lot deeper a lot of times than that. So I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I would love to hear what you think about this down below. And then this last quote, and I'm going to end on a bang here. This last quote is, the picture of the laborer extolled by Marxist theory has not, there might be a typo there, has not become a part of the modern conscience. He is seen as a producer of wealth, has now become a part of the modern conscience. There we go. He is seen as the producer of wealth and well-being, an essential partner in the great work of civilized society. And so for me, just the fact that the term Marxist theory was there kind of jumps out at me. I'm like, oh, hello. There it is. And I'm went over this quote many, many times. And I tried to process it. Now, as somebody who does not support a Marxist view of society, it's not something I adhere to. I do find this a very troubling statement. And if you love Marxist theory, this is a wonderful statement for you, right? That's great. And you can state down below how much you agree with this and you love it. And I'm still trying to process through this statement by her. And I've tried to reread this quote in different ways to see, maybe I'm misunderstanding this. And it sounds like she is advocating for this picture of Marxist theory. And it's not a theory I will ever adopt into my own life because, in my opinion, Marxism eliminates God, and it also creates a ruling class that contributes nothing to society, but instead takes from those that contribute everything. And I find it's really ironic that Maria Montessori, a person who speaks so passionately about the process of freeing the child, would adopt a theory that seeks to enslave a society with just one ruling class. And I keep on wondering, what is the purpose of setting a child free when he becomes an adult? If when he becomes an adult, the elite class, a governmental class that doesn't actually contribute anything, that doesn't produce anything, it's a class that doesn't really work, takes everything from the worker and only hands back maybe table scraps in return for those hardworking individuals. And I find it a bizarre thing to promote. That's just my opinion. You're welcome to have a different one. But that is chapter 2 in a nutshell. Now, of course, there's a lot more words to chapter 2 that I didn't include today. So if you want to go back and read it and show me I missed something, or if you have a quote that you really liked or that made you think really hard that I didn't include in this video, feel free to leave it down below as well. If you disliked this video, I totally understand. I was very opinionated in it, right? I gave my opinion and you're free to dislike it. But if you did like it, hit the like button. Hit that like button, and please share this video with others who maybe are questioning whether or not Montessori is right for them. I do love Montessori. I love the method, but I'm afraid in this particular category, I don't agree with her. I don't see eye to eye. And again, maybe it's because I've misunderstood what she's saying here. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, share it with other people, comment down below. I'd be curious what your thoughts are, what your opinions are. And also, if you like what I'm doing here, subscribe to the channel, and we'll be sure to have more discussions in the future. But until the next video, I hope you all are having a wonderful week, and I will see you again soon.